Senator Mortimer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the senator from 32 yield to a few questions, if I could?
Senator Tippets, would you yield?
Mr. President, may I explain my answer to that question? And I apologize to the senator from 30, but I want to explain.
Senator Tippets, perhaps you could yield first and then explain when you,
Thank you, Mr. President.
in your answer.
I will yield. Yes.
Okay. Senator Tippets to state his inquiry. Senator Mortimer. Sorry.
Mr. President, is the senator willing to yield to some questions?
Senator has yielded, yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator from 32. The first question that I have is, will the Department of Health and Welfare be sharing information from its database with a new health care exchange?
Senator Tippets to respond.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Mortimer, before I get to your question directly, and I will answer that, I want to make this statement. Senator, I apologize to you for me taking time to do this in responding to your question. I've been notified that there may be many questions asked, and I just want to remind the Senate that the purpose of asking questions is to obtain information that one doesn't have. It's not to be used as a debate strategy, nor in an attempt to interject debate into the discussion. So I am perfectly willing this time and any other time to respond to any and all questions that are legitimate questions for information. I'm not willing to engage in questioning for the purposes of interjecting debate. With that said, Mr. President and Senator, that question sounds like a very legitimate question and a fair question. Yes, the Department of Health and Welfare will be sharing information, and they'll be sharing that information as people come into their office to apply for Medicaid. And when they apply for Medicaid, the eligibility will be determined, and if they don't qualify, they'll also be referred to the insurance exchange if they may qualify for subsidized premiums there, and if they qualify to purchase information through the exchange. Let me tell you, that information will be gathered and will be available to the federal government, whether we have a state exchange or whether we have a federal exchange. There'll be no difference there.
Mr. President.
Senator Mortimer.
A comment.
Senator, do you have
a comment before an additional question, if I could?
A comment will be considered debate.
Mr. President, for a question, for the
Senator
senator
Tippets,
for 32.
Could you yield to a further question?
Yes, Mr. President, I would yield.
Senator Mortimer to state his question.
Senator from 32, if a state health care exchange is established, would that state health care exchange be required to assess any penalties or taxes or fines set forth by the Affordable Health Care Act to the citizens of Idaho?
Senator Tippets to respond.
Mr. President and Senator Mortimer, no, it would not. The exchange has no authority to assess penalties. Now, I'm not saying that the residents of the state of Idaho would be excused from those penalties, but that will be up to the federal government, up to the IRS. That will not be a function of the state exchange.
Thank you. Thank you, good Senator and Mr. President. For an additional question.
Senator Tippets, would you respond further?
I would yield, Mr. President.
Senator Mortimer, state your question.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator from 32. And I just want them to know that these questions were generated as I reviewed and as you were speaking. So I apologize if there's some feeling of intent to lead a debate. So I apologize to the senator if he felt that way. Senator from 32, will the people that work for a state exchange, should it be established, be employees of the state of Idaho?
Mr. President and
Senator Tippets, respond.
No, I don't believe that they will be employees of the state of Idaho. The state exchange has the authority under the bill to contract with vendors and others to provide the services that are required. Neither the exchange, board members, nor those whom they contract with would be state employees. And Senator, let me further say that there was no feeling on my part that your questions are inappropriate. You just happened to be the first one to ask, and I just wanted to make that was clear. But your questions have been very appropriate. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator from 32. For an additional couple of questions.
Senator Tippets, would you respond further?
I would yield, Mr. President.
Senator Mortimer, state your inquiry.
Mr. President, Senator from 32, given the response that you gave to that last question, will the exchange promulgate rules and will they be approved by the legislature?
Senator Tippets to respond.
Mr. President and Senator Mortimer, no, the exchange will not promulgate rules as they're not a state agency. They will put together a plan of operation. They will establish bylaws, and those bylaws have to be approved by the Director of the Department of Insurance, but they will not promulgate rules that will then be, that we would have oversight over.
Senator Mortimer.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, Mr. President, for another question.
Senator Tippets, would you respond?
Yes, I'd be happy to yield.
Senator Mortimer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator from 32, in your opening debate, you mentioned a number of $30 million, and I know where the $20 million is coming from, but you mentioned that there may need to be an additional $10 million for the department. Were you making reference to the Department of Health and Welfare in that additional $10 million?
Senator Tippets.
Mr. President and Senator, no, I was referring to the Department of Insurance, and in an effort to fully understand the complete costs, we inquired of both departments additional funding that they might need should this legislation pass. The Department of Insurance told us that the $20.3 million grant that's already been awarded to the state, that would be transferred to the exchange, and they expected that the exchange, actually not the Department of Insurance, would need additional funds and that they would be eligible to apply for and likely receive further grants. The best guess at this point is that could be up to another $10 million that the exchange would apply for.
For further clarification, Mr. President of the Senator from 32.
Senator Tippets, would you respond?
I'd be happy to yield, yes.
Senator Mortimer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator from 32. You mentioned that that $10 million was for the Department of Insurance. Is the Department of Insurance feeling that they will be providing additional information or some other type of services? I'm trying to figure out what that $10 million would be needed for in the Department of Insurance.
Senator Tippets.
Mr. President and Senator, if I said the Department of Insurance, and I believe that I did initially, I think I was mistaken. I think the way that really happens is that the $20 million grant will be transferred to the exchange, and I believe it's the exchange that would then further apply for grants, and anticipating the exchange would need more money to get the exchange put together, up and running, to take care of all the costs that they would have. After the first year, it's got to be totally self-supporting, but in that first year, there are lots of startup costs, and the list of those would be very long, and I'm not familiar with all of those costs, but they tell me that the cost of the exchange would have for that initial startup would be potentially an initial another $10 million.
Thank you, Senator from 32, for an additional question.
Senator Tippets to respond.
Mr. President, I respond.
Senator Mortimer.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator from 32. If there's a liability to the federal government, if there was any misuse of this $20 million or the additional $10 million, who would it have? Do we have any knowledge of any expectation by the federal government for that to be repaid to them in any way, or if there's some type of inappropriate activity or insufficient funds to complete the project? What is the obligation of the exchange to repay that money?
Senator Tippets.
Mr. President and Senator, we don't believe there's any obligation to repay the funds. Now, if the funds are insufficient, they could apply for additional grants. An additional $10 million above the 20 that we talked about, it's not a cap. That's just the best guess of what they might need. So they could obtain additional funds if they need it. But it's our understanding there's no obligation to pay those funds back. If, for example, we at some time down the road decided that we would rather default to a federal exchange as opposed to a state exchange, those funds would not be required to be returned.
Thank you. One additional question, please.
Senator Tippets, would you respond once more?
Yes, Mr. President, I will respond.
Senator Mortimer.
Thank you. And it has to do with the expenditure of funds again for the exchange, if that exchange is set up. Mr. President, Senator from 32, any excess funds generated by the exchange what would they be used for, or where would they go?
Senator Tippets.
Mr. President and Senator from 30. I'll tell you what I believe, and I hope that it's accurate, and the department can let us know. We've got someone that's able to visit with them. I believe that the funds are only, even though there's a grant given, those funds are only awarded as they're expended. So I don't believe that there's a possibility that they will overexpend. That we'll have additional funds that aren't expended because they're only given, I believe, as they're used.
Mr. President, for a clarification of that answer, please.
Senator Tippets.
Senator.
I would yield again.
Okay, Senator Mortimer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator from 32. The question that was probably not asked properly was not necessarily in regards to the initial monies required by the exchange to set it up, but once the fees are starting to be assessed and it's in a normal operating basis, if there were excess fees generated, what would be, what would be used, those funds be used for?
Senator Tippets to respond.
Mr. President and Senator from 30, if I understand the question correctly, it's if the fees that were assessed for administrative costs end up being more than was necessary for administration of the exchange, then my guess would be, of course, this would be up to the exchange, but we would expect them to adjust the rates that they're charging for administrative fees so that we don't end up with that situation. I don't know of any other use that those funds could be put to.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senators and Senator from 32. Thank you for your answers and your indulgence. Thank you so much.